All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. Right now, we were moving through our study this week of what I'm calling postmodern poets and nonfiction writers. And so we're in the middle of our three poets we're going to look at this week. So we're going to look at Frank Bidart. He was born in 1939 in Bakersfield, California, educated at the University of California at Riverside and Harvard, where he was a student and friend of two poets we've read in this course from the earlier mid-20th century generation of American poets, Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell. And I think Lowell was his teacher, and then they later became friends, and then after Lowell's death, Bedart had become the editor of Lowell's collected poems. So he had this friendship throughout his life with both Bishop and Lowell, or throughout his early life. And though is a different poet from them, or especially from Lowell. I think there's some similarities with Bishop, which we'll talk about. He has had a very consistent teaching career. He's taught at Wellesley in Massachusetts since 1972 and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Seems like he just kind of came east from California to Cambridge, where Harvard and Wellesley are, and just pretty much never left. And he's more recently collaborated with James Franco, who I think has made some movie of one of his poems or something. I didn't look too deep into it, sorry. And has also, again, been the editor of the collected poems of Robert Lowell. He's published over 8 books of poetry in his career, which starts in the 70s, I think, and won the Pulitzer Prize for his collected poems in 2017. And he, so the phrase, the sentences that I've excerpted from the Norton bio of Bidart say that he attended graduate school in English at Harvard, where he became acquainted with Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop. Both poets are in this volume, they helpfully tell you. While Lowell and many other poets turned to autobiographical confessional writing, Bidart's poems stood out. They sounded like confessional poems, but the confessors were characters that embodied, as Bedart says, the anti-self, someone who is all the things that one is not. So he turns away from that confessional poetry that defined the generation of Lowell and Berryman and Plath that we looked at toward the beginning of the class. And he, like Bishop, is a somewhat more impersonal writer, and he uses this impersonality in a particular way. He's known for writing a particular genre of poem called the dramatic monologue. And the dramatic monologue is a genre of poetry. You can define it in certain very specific ways, but that apply to some of the first dramatic monologues from the English poetry of the 19th century, but I don't think that it's very helpful to define it in a very specific way. I prefer to define it in a much more general way, and to say that a dramatic monologue is essentially a poem where the speaker is clearly a fictional character distinct from the author. And you can see the word dramatic there means that it's, well, both dramatic and monologue are terms from drama, terms from theater. So just as a character in a play will give a monologue, as we saw Troy Maxon giving monologues, or his wife Rose giving monologues in Fences 2 weeks ago. So this is a type of poem that's like a monologue in a play. And the character is distinct from the author. The speaker is clearly not the author. So in confessional poetry, we see that the speaker is very closely identified with the author. It seems to be autobiographical. And even in poetry that you wouldn't necessarily call confessional, such as the other 2 poems we're reading this week, Lee Young Lee's Persimmons and Louise Glick's October, the speaker is pretty clearly identified with the poet, and that's often the way that poetry works. It's often a very autobiographical genre. But for Bedart and for other poets who practice the dramatic monologue, the speaker is distinct, is a clearly fictional character, is a dramatic artifice. And so this is a form of lyric poetry that's actually closer to drama and to fiction than to conventional lyric poetry with its autobiographical bias. And we see this quite clearly in Ellen West, which is perhaps Bedart's most famous poem. It is a poem that's too long to read aloud in its entirety, but I want to excerpt a few passages and see what it is about. So this is a poem based on a real case history, a real psychiatric case history that Bedart found of a woman named Ellen West who struggled with an eating disorder. And Bedart writes a poem that is Ellen West's own account of herself, her description of her own sort of subjective experience of having this eating disorder, but it's interspersed with case notes from the psychiatrist. And I believe, they don't tell you in the Norton footnote, but I believe these are real. I think maybe, I don't know if they're lightly edited or not edited at all, but these are real case notes that Bidart is interspersing. And here I think we definitely see what I'm talking about when I talk about postmodernism. That he's taken a true story, but he's fictionalized it, but he's also incorporated documents that are not his own into it to create this text that is a kind of pastiche of the real and the fictional. And nevertheless, though, it's not fully postmodern in that I think he's trying to express a certain kind of true experience. And he uses Ellen West's ordeal, whether this is true to her experience or not, we can't say, as a kind of metaphor for the experience of the artist. And he's been criticized actually for this in some of the same ways that Plath was criticized for Daddy for using the Holocaust as a trope for her relationship with her father. Does Bedart have the right to use this eating disorder as a trope for the kind of experience of the artist? And we don't know, I don't know. That's a question that different readers will have to come to. It is interesting that another poet we're reading in this week is Louise Glick, who has heavily praised Bedart and has sort of said that she thinks he's one of the best contemporary poets. And she herself, as they talked about in her introduction to the Norton selection of her work, also dealt with an eating disorder as a teenager. And she wrote about it both in her poetry and in her essays in almost the exact same terms in which Bedart writes Ellen West. So in that sense, I think it accorded with her experience. So, Bedart writing kind of across gender and across the lines of this experience, nevertheless seems to resonate with a woman who did have this experience, for whatever that's worth. That doesn't settle the ethical question entirely, and different people will have to come to different conclusions. But essentially, what Bedart is showing in Ellen West is that Ellen's eating disorder, her desire to starve herself, to purge herself, is akin in his telling to a desire of the soul to transcend nature that takes the same form in poetry and in art. That the artist, if I could put it this way, because sort of the artist, like the anorexic, is trying to transcend the merely given physical reality of life. And there's also a political or an identity political edge to the argument as well, because Ellen West also feels confined by gender and by heterosexuality, that she says, I have to give up my ideal to become a wife. And the case notes of the doctor refer to her homoerotic desire. And in this view, heteronormativity and the gender roles it assigns to people is also based on nature, is based on the idea that it's natural that a man marries a woman and they reproduce. And so the body, nature, heteronormativity, prescribed gender roles, all of these things are things that the anorexic, the poet, the artist, the queer want to transcend, want to get away from. And so there's a kind of complexity here, because on the one hand, there's something I think that Bedart thinks is ultimately admirable in this desire to deny the given. And I think we're meant to read this poem with a certain sympathy for West's struggle, and to see in the notes of the male doctor and in the attitude of her husband a kind of unimaginative, conservative in the bad sense, sort of just an oppressive attitude that her own voice and her identification with artists like the opera singer Maria Callas, or with mythological figures like Faust, who sold his soul to the devil for knowledge, that we're supposed to, I think, identify with this, or find this an admirable gesture of rebellion on the part of a woman, of a queer person, of an artist, of a singer, of a poet. That's all on the one hand. On the other hand, it would be pretty, I think, insensitive of Bidart, or of us, not to note the cost. That it's not something you should glamorize, to sort of have this this disorder that ultimately ends for Ellen West in death. And is that maybe we can think of this in some of the same terms we were thinking of Blanche Dubois and Troy Maxon in. This is a dramatic monologue. Ellen West is a character in a drama, and maybe we can see it as tragic in that strict definition of tragedy, as the fall of a person who has a nobility that is tied to her flaw. And so the nobility and the flaw really are the same thing, viewed two different ways, which is this unappeasable quest to transcend the merely given and the merely natural, which leads finally to her death. So just to read a few passages from the poem, I mean, it's a long poem, and there's a lot of sort of details we can look at, but by the same token, I think it's a poem whose thesis, if I can call it that, is pretty easily summed up. So, I knew that to become a wife, I would have to give up my ideal. Even as a child, I saw that the quote-unquote natural process of aging is for one's middle to thicken, one's skin to blotch, as happened to my mother and her mother. I loathed nature. At 12, pancakes became the most terrible thought there is. I shall defeat nature. In the hospital, when they weigh me, I wear weights serenely sewn into my belt. So this hatred of nature, this desire to transcend nature, of aging, of what both nature and the social order that justifies itself based on its fidelity to nature does to a woman, is what she wants to transcend. And presumably Bedart, as a gay poet, is also rebelling against a heteronormative and gender prescriptive society. And yet, again, it's the end here is death. Sort of art, which is one way of transcending nature, is just kind of an intermediate stage before the ultimate leaving of nature, which is death. And the doctor notes, he says, in her diary, she writes that art is the mutual permeation of the world of the body and the world of the spirit. So art is a kind of compromise. Art, maybe a better way to think of it here, is that art is the good thing, the good aspect of the phenomenon of which the eating disorder is the bad aspect, which is a desire to transcend nature. But art is the point of balance, where nature and what would reject it, the spirit, interpenetrate, mutually permeate each other. Whereas if you take either one to its extent, to its ultimate limit, you get either literal death, Ellen West's death from an eating disorder, or the suicide it brings on the one hand, or you get the kind of death of social stasis, of just becoming a comfortable wife. Okay? So maybe art is redemptive because, while it's akin to anorexia, it is not the extreme that anorexia is, even as it lodges the same protest against the given and the natural. And she says, is it bitter? She's writing about Maria Callas, the opera singer. Is it bitter? Does her soul tell her that she was an idiot ever to think anything material wholly could satisfy? Perhaps it says the only way to escape the history of styles is not to have a body. So this is where, though, the thing I just said about art being the the perfect balance point between accepting the given so much that you live a death in life and rejecting it so much that you simply die. Nevertheless, art's own logic seems to be toward death. Because the way that Bedart has Ellen express it in this poem is that the only way to so the doom, the fate of the artist is to become outdated, to sing in a style that's outdated, to write in a poetry that's outdated, to write literature in a way that an academic will come along and say, well, this is modernist, this is postmodernist, this is realist, assign it all neatly to a bunch of categories so we can sort of safely ignore it and it doesn't touch us because we've compartmentalized it in these the prison of these categorizations. And she's writing about Maria Callas, who's a real life opera singer, by the way, and saying that as she ages, she probably sees that her style of singing in her youth that had brought her such acclaim is now out of date. And so she realizes that the only way to escape the history of styles is not to have a body, which means that the only way to get out of the prison of history is through death. And this is why I think when I tried to sort of rescue the poem for normative morality by saying that art was the perfect balance point between nature and the rejection of nature that leads to death, is really that's too optimistic a way to think about it. I think Bidart is much more intransigent a poet here, and is showing that the logic of rejecting nature as an artist leads to this disillusion. And we see that too in the last passage I want to look at. Only by acting, choosing, rejecting have I made myself, discovered who and what Ellen can be. But then again, I think, no, this I is anterior to name, gender, action, fashion, matter itself. Trying to stop my hunger with food is like trying to appease thirst with ink. So at first in this passage, she says a more conventional artistic statement. I've made myself through the agency of my own creativity. But then she draws back and comes to the much more nihilistic proposition that no, the thing I am is before any materialization, any incarnation, any human embodiment. And so just as I can't feed myself with food, I can't feed myself with ink. Art is not enough. And this is why she must die. And so again, I think the way to think about this poem, which is obviously very troubling in certain ways, though it's an extremely popular, celebrated, classic poem as well, so maybe I don't know how troubling it is, but obviously it's troubling in the way that it seems to endorse this tendency toward death. I think the way to think of it is just to repeat myself in that tragic way that we thought of Troy or of Blanche in the two tragic dramas we read. We should think of this dramatic monologue maybe in the same tragic sense, that we have a character whose grandeur is not a fully morally acceptable grandeur, but is a spiritually vast and impressive grandeur that nevertheless can't help but lead to doom and to death. And that's Frank Bedart, and that's Ellen West. Thanks very much and have a great day.